hacking training and expert advisory services to governments. Prior to Hypasec, she headed the Information Protection Group and International Intelligence for the Aramco family, reestablishing international business operations, helping to stabilize the oil market, and implementing digital security after the company suffered from the devastating Shamoon cyber warfare attacks. We would like to thank OWL Cyber Defense for generously sponsoring this panel and this conference. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Kim.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've got a great panel for you to end the conference. And I think we still have, no, actually we have everyone now. So I'm going to start the questioning. I'm going to go through sort of questions for all of the panelists, and I invite everyone to weigh in on any of the questions. I'll single out a few of the panelists for subsequent questions, but I also want to invite anyone in the audience to submit questions as well. So we will see them on the screen below, and then I will, at any time you can ask questions and I'll interject them in between the other ones. So I just wanted to start out by providing an overview from the panelists about sort of what is the state of play, let's say in the Middle East right now in terms of cyber. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, how would you characterize the cyber threat landscape in the Middle East, and how is it different from sort of the physical threat landscape that exists there now? And anyone can jump in.
If I could start, I just wanted to say that it's extremely volatile. I think we've seen nonstop activity throughout 2020, of course, but it definitely was active 2018 and 2019. You're just seeing Iran really establishing itself and going aggressively after its neighbors, a little more blatant in their activity, a little more claiming their work. But I, of course, welcome the input of the other panelists.
Yeah, I can jump in. I would echo the kind of volatile comment. I think the landscape in the Middle East is pretty unique. There's a lot of complicated relationships. It's multifaceted, and I think it's one of the regions where you don't necessarily have, one big player. There's quite a few countries that have developed offensive cyber capabilities, including Iran, Israel, others in the Gulf. So I think it's one of those where there's kind of a range of actors, and you have those top tier ones, but there's also a kind of other groups who are also lower level that are just as active.
If we're looking on the threats in the Middle East, we can look
a little louder.
If we're looking on the threats in the Middle East, we can look both on the tension between Iran and Israel. And Iran and Israel can fight in the battlefield, in Syria, in Lebanon, and Iran and Israel can fight in the cyber domain. And this is really fascinating, because if we are comparing it to any other country that have tension between them and have some kind of a cyber war right now, we don't really see the physical war happening in the same place. And this is fascinating to see it in the Middle East. If we're looking on another threat actors, for example, the Palestinian threat actors, we see both cyber attacks against Israel and cyber attacks against the Palestinian. And for the first time, we saw last year the IDF that attacked a base of Hamas after a cyber attack on Israel. And this is really fascinating to see them both combined together.
So that's a really interesting distinction between where we're seeing physical activity and cyber activity, and you're saying that it's rare to see both of them at the same time. So is that an issue of capabilities, or is it just an issue of, well, I'll just open that up to you. Why do you think that is?
I think that this is part of interests. If we can—
A little louder, Ohad, we're having trouble.
It is the matter of interests. If we can fight in the battlefield, people will die. But if we can fight and combine fighting in the battlefield and hiding on computers or something like that, and we can protect ourselves for physical warfare, it is better. And I think one of the interests of Iran, in my opinion, is not to have direct fight or direct war with any other country. They saw what happened in Iran-Iraq war, and now they are fighting with Hezbollah, for example. And Hezbollah is not Iran directly. Iran can command them, but they can't really send their guards to fight alongside with Hezbollah. I think with cyber warfare, they can achieve something that no one can achieve before. They can hide themselves and they can say, this is not us. And this gives them a really good advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I think to pick up on that, it's interesting to note as well that sometimes you do see in a strategy to prevent escalation, you see a lot of cyber operations kind of in conjunction with physical ones. So if you think about the Iranian-US tensions last year and around this time, and there were kind of tit-for-tat attacks on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, and you kind of had retaliation through potentially a cyber operation, but there were still kind of attacking tankers as well. So there can be situations where those kind of are complemented.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that plausible deniability is a really important factor that Iran has absolutely touched on and emphasized before. They can, sure, go physically after anything, an oil field in Saudi Arabia or a ship in the Gulf. But once they start dabbling in cyber and going after that, you know, they can blame it on anybody else, which they have. They can point fingers. They can absolutely deny it. So they're still acting offensively and kind of taking their revenge out for their world adversaries that they feel have wronged them. But at the same time, they feel safer and they won't be sanctioned maybe to any more sanctions because they can just say, it wasn't us. You don't have the technical pointing to attribute it to us.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, this is not them for real.
Sound.
For example, Symantec exposed last year that a group, Turla from Russia, APT group from Russia, used the infrastructure of a threat actor from Iran named Oil Rig. And this is really interesting because the attribution process is so hard. And even if we're publishing a report, we are trying to reduce the level of confidence so we can make sure that we are not blaming any country, but by any malicious move in the Middle East. This is really hard, this is really tricky. And this depends on a lot of private cyber firms and both the army, for example, of Israel that need to have this clash between Iran and Israel.
We tend to focus all of the attention on Iran as this discussion, the opening discussion has sort of pointed that out. I mean, Israel also is the strongest one with capabilities there. But I'm wondering if you guys could sort of rank the cyber capabilities of all the actors in the Middle East. And are there ones that we're not really seeing because we're just not paying attention, their activities are less visible? I'll open that up to all of you.
I would say UAE has been increasing their capabilities quite a bit, and they are definitely a country that should be watched. And we all know that Israel is highly capable. The Saudi government has enacted its own teams as well, in addition to everything, and the Iranians are extremely capable as well.
Yeah, I think I would say, I mean, we know that Israel is on a level far beyond the other countries in the region. And I think one of the differences to note is that there are multiple kind of actors in the region. Iran has a very, strong and developing program. I think some of the other countries tend to outsource their capabilities. So they can't necessarily be homegrown. They might not have the in-house capabilities that they could develop, so they have the resources and they can contract them out. So you do get a lot of again, one of the other kinds of actors that are kind of prominent in the region are the hackers for hire. So you do have these firms that governments can go and contract to do the work for them.
Mm-hmm.
That's an excellent point, and I'd like to build off of what Chris said. I think Israel is undoubtedly #1 in the region, but it merits watching other actors who right now our attention might not be on, but tomorrow they could be just as big of a threat or just as strong with capabilities. And we saw that with Iran, where 7 to 8 years ago, nobody was really looking at Iran in a cyber realm. They were quietly working below the scenes. They were developing, not only conscription, they were using their military conscription to staff their cyber programs, develop it in their universities, and it has exploded. It is a very sophisticated program that only grows. So to Chris's point, we really do need to watch the other actors and see what's going on, despite the upfront players that are today, because tech changes so quickly.
Is there one that you think is a surprise that might show up that we haven't really anticipated?
That's a great question. I personally, as much as I know we have to focus on state actors and nation state because they have the resources, I always like to consider the independent cyber criminal contingents, which can also harness capabilities. And so I would say, let's watch Hezbollah or let's watch the ISIS capability in cyber because they are very dedicated, they have the funding, and they have the actors that can absolutely make them stronger. So I would maybe put the cyber criminal contingent to watch in addition to nation state.
So have we actually seen that? Sahar, you talked about sort of hiring companies and things, third actors, but have we seen mercenaries, independent mercenaries that have been involved, that have been employed, or even have we seen cooperation between, let's say, Iran and Russia and Iran and China? Who are the third-party actors that are being engaged for this kind of activity?
So I have quite a few comments about that one. I think especially in terms of the hackers for hire landscape, that's something that needs to be dug into a lot more. I don't think there's as much reporting or focus on it, and I think part of it is because it's difficult. There's a lot of layers of obscurity between kind of the target and the end customer who is buying those contracting services, and often it can go through private investigators, lawyers. There's a lot of deniability along that, and it becomes harder and harder to attribute. Another point I would make is that in terms of the Gulf countries that we were talking about that have capabilities, often it's against each other is where they're directing them. So it's kind of interesting to see that you wouldn't maybe necessarily have the interactions between them and Iran as much as you would against each other. Kind of an interesting note, and especially against Israel as well. A lot of them will have different kinds of arms or trade deals or whatever kind of deals with Israel that they probably wouldn't want to disrupt. And in terms of other actors in the Middle East, Russia and China are both actually quite prominent. I won't go as far as to say there's collaboration. I think that's unlikely. Not to say that it couldn't happen in the future, but from what my research has shown, Russia has been very active in the last few years, again, with parallels that you can see in the physical world as well, in terms of Syria, for example. Again, a lot of arms deals, economic deals, trade deals. Obviously, there's a big question of oil and OPEC exports and things. So you see a lot of Russian espionage, I think, and they're pretty invested. So I think that's, they're trying to fill that power vacuum that the US has left since withdrawing from a lot of the region. And China is actually really interesting because recently we've seen kind of big campaigns that are targeting the Middle East and particularly Iran from China. And so it's funny because you wouldn't really, it's kind of the opposite of collaboration. They're being targeted quite a lot. And it's because, there's a lot of investment going into the Middle East from China, infrastructure, joint ventures, all kinds of different sectors as they kind of go through their One Belt, One Road initiative. And all across, Central Asia and the Middle East, you kind of see that. So they're really invested in making sure that that succeeds and that they have a foothold, for the future. So yeah, both of them have kind of very strong espionage presence in the Middle East.
Another interesting aspect of the cyber warfare in the Middle East is that we have here in the Middle East a lot of dictatorship countries or not democratic countries. And on that matter, there are countries as Iran that spying also against their own people. And this is really interesting to examine because we see the same threat actor as Charmin Kitten, for example, they're trying to hack credentials or to steal credentials from emails from people in Israel, from people in the US, and from people inside Iran. They're trying to spy against Radio Farda, for example. This is really interesting to see both threat actor, the same threat actor trying to point to different aspects of the victims.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think you could add one of the points that Ohad mentioned, which is that, again, something that kind of wouldn't point towards collaboration necessarily, but you've seen Russia using Iranian infrastructure, Iranian tools, and stealing them, using them for their own ops, whether it's for a false flag or piggybacking off their operations. So I kind of think that they, again, might be close militarily, potentially, and in other ways, but in terms of cyber operations, I don't totally see that collaboration angle.
Interesting.
I'd actually be really happy to speak to that. I understand what you're saying, Sahar, but I'm definitely happy to go on record saying that the collaboration between Iran and Russia is documented in bits of source code that have been recycled. Maybe not your big ones, like think of Shamoon, but in the Triton and Trisus malware, it was a 2017 attack. There's definitely overlap between some Iran and Russian coding. There's definitely been public support from Iran saying they will support Russia in any way possible for the next election targeting. They've gone on record saying that they are happy to train with them, conduct the same social engineering campaigns. APT 34 and APT 28 or 29 have also supported each other publicly with the multi-layered social engineering on social media, establishing a first level of actors on, say, LinkedIn or Facebook that then friends a second level, lending to some fidelity, and then going out and expanding that. So I'm definitely happy to say that there's absolutely evidence of collaboration that has slipped between both Russia and Iran, and then Iran and China. And I think that's only going to expand. They've covered their tracks for now, but they've also made some mistakes. And I think we're going to see more in the future.
What kind of mistakes?
So they've let their infrastructure leak. If you've ever looked at Certfa Labs, who is a wonderful documentary, they document everything that Iran has done. These are domains that Iran has used that are also seen in Russia. Iranians have also used, there were a handful, 16 or 17 in the Triton Trisis malware. They've let all of those use. They were coming from the Russian Federation, but Iranians were using them. And that's notable because now Iran generally moves through Europe, right? They're using Dutch or German infrastructure, but they've let all of their previous infrastructure that they've used been open. And they've also made the mistake of talking about it on mainly WhatsApp versus Telegram or Signal or something encrypted. So you might see some technical digital footprints that you can't confirm when you move to chats or seeing other pieces that they sell or other code that they're working with via Telegram or something that's leaked. You can then confirm the technical pieces with their chat. So they've kind of not done themselves any favors there.
Interesting. So who would you identify as the most vulnerable nation state in the Middle East, in terms of either just defending or also in terms of just being the target that everyone wants to go after?
My vote on that as most vulnerable for right now, I think, is Saudi Arabia. And I say that because unfortunately, they've had the repeated Shamoon exposure, 2012, 2014, 17, 18. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, then in 2019, we're targeted again with either Dustemon or Zero Clear. I forget which one was used. It might have been both. Both, thank you. Yeah. And so those pieces of malware continuously infect them. And I think that it's just a matter of they just need to concentrate and maybe use some third-party technology and advice for right now to strengthen themselves before they have an in-house program. But I've repeatedly seen Saudi Arabia attacked, government, private, public sector. It's everywhere.
Does anyone else want to?
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, Steph, because, obviously there's geopolitics, but there's also opportunity with capability. And Saudi Arabia, it's a large country. It's got a lot of infrastructure. They have been doing a lot of digitization and pushing that envelope. And at the same time, they established their CERT officially in late 2018. And it's one of these things where there's very spread out networks. There's lots of things that can be hit. And unfortunately, the focus is not on critical infrastructure quite yet in Saudi Arabia.
So I've had a question here from one audience person, Rebecca Lucas, asks, what's known about Turkish cyber capabilities? Despite their growing involvement in the region over the last few years, Syria and Libya, they remain absent from most of these discussions. Why is that the case? It's a really good question.
They're actually not absent. I think they're not focused on as much maybe as the other countries, but possibly not publicly reported in terms of attribution. But Turkey does have pretty advanced capabilities. I think they've been around for a while, but I think it's becoming more and more visible now. You first had kind of there was a big hacktivist scene in Turkey, and there were a lot of groups. Some of them were quite nationalistic types, but you had other ones that were anti-regime, anti-government, and I don't see them active as much anymore. And but I do see that the government's capabilities have grown, and they've used kind of both commercial spyware, I guess, that you can buy from vendors, but they also have developed their own capabilities as well.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, we've actually seen some very interesting attacks here in the Netherlands and a few other European countries when Turkish geopolitics have shifted over to here, because we have a large population of expatriate Turks and also a history of Turkish folks here. And we're seeing that capability go up and up and up. We had a series of attacks against Dutch government websites when there was a tiff, so to speak, between one of the Turkish ministers during voting for Erdogan. and also the Turkish coup. We saw quite a few attacks.
Yeah, I'd like to definitely everything that Chris said, I've also seen as well. And then if you go again, independent of the government, Turkey has a pretty solid relationship with the Eastern European cyber criminal underground, working in cryptocurrency, just working in general, kind of everything from script kiddies to more sophisticated cyber criminal attacks. But I think it's also a great point to Sahar's, the Turkish government is extremely strong in continuing to build their cyber capabilities. And since they share a border with Iran, and Erdogan is, of course, an autocratic ruler, when will that relationship develop, right? They're already targeting dissidents in one another's countries, so there's some activity there. So when will that continue, spying on your population via apps or expanding your targeting of your dissident population? How will that work out between Iran and Turkey? And that's definitely a leg that they could extend and work with one another.
So I have a question, another question from, I'm going to mess up the last name, Karam Shahur. What are the different types of capabilities of Middle Eastern states? What are the strengths and weaknesses of each important player? I mean, you talked about in some cases they were, like Sahar, you said from Turkey, they're purchasing things from like hacking team from companies that are the kind of tools that everyone can use. So like who has the most, besides Israel, let's sort of take that off the table because we already know that they have strong capabilities. But who's using the most sophisticated tools and techniques at this point?
I think if we're looking on the scope of it or the scale of it, Iran uses the most advanced tool in the Middle East, except Israel, of course, and they're using a really large scale of tools. So they're doing everything. They're starting with espionage, destruction, and they can do really anything that they want. They can do social engineering too. They have a lot of groups that really active and really exposed in the last few years. I really recommend to look at Shamoon, for example, attacks. That was really interesting operation to see how one country in the Middle East decided to attack another one and to distract and to destroy infrastructures of companies. I didn't see any other threat actor in the Middle East does the same. I saw a lot of them using espionage operations. For example, if we mentioned Turkey before, only on January, Reuters exposed a huge operation, espionage operation of Turkey. We saw the Palestinians uses some groups and they targeting soldiers of Israel, for example, or other regimes or other governments in the Middle East. But the most sophisticated threat actors in the Middle East and from the Middle East is Iran, for sure. Is my opinion.
Actually,
sorry, go ahead.
I might say something a little bit different. One is that, every actor kind of has a range of capabilities, and for some things you just don't need the most advanced tooling. Obviously, there are many actors who do have, their own custom malware, for example, and that can be quite advanced. But the other thing that I was going to mention is that Iran, I mean, in terms of the wipers, for example, for me, it had a huge impact in terms of financially and operationally and things like that. But technically, a wiper or even ransomware, for example, doesn't necessarily need to be that sophisticated. That stuff is probably easier for other people to acquire than kind of advanced tooling. And I think that the key point there is that espionage operations do tend to be more advanced. The point is that you have to get on the network, which is sometimes the hard part, but you have to stay there, which means you have to be stealthy, you have to remain undetected. Whereas with kind of the destructive ones, you have to get on the network still, which requires some skill, but then you just release a wiper. So, in terms of advanced, it depends on kind of what you mean. You could be talking about tooling technically, you could be talking about their operational tempo or how they move around a network, persistence, that kind of thing. So I think it gets a little bit more nuanced than that.
Excellent points. You're right. One thing is that Iran demonstrates both capabilities. They have the wiper, the quick and dirty destructive. At the same time, if you've seen the Mabna campaign or even the Samas ransomware, if you read those indictments, they know to access and stay on those networks undetected for months, if not years. Mabna was a 5 to 6 year long operation that netted a lot of intellectual property and a lot of espionage. And then of course, Samas, the ransomware, netted them quite a bit of money. And that was, 2 or 3 years as well. And they were in systems and revisiting systems. And then I think the only other thing I'd want to add there is not only can they do destructive versus social engineering versus staying on, but they're also known to now be able to defeat, in certain cases, two-factor authentication or multi-factor. And that's extremely concerning because that's sophistication that you have to research and kind of just really look into and dedicate and tailor your craft.
So we've been talking about the cyber capabilities sort of as a standalone. One of the audience questions from Leo Hochberg is about sort of the combination of cyber and physical. We haven't really seen, and we've seen obviously with Stuxnet, we've seen, you can call Shamoon a cyber physical attack because it caused some kind of physical destruction on the computers themselves. But where I'm talking about something that leaps from the digital realm to that physical realm, like we saw with Stuxnet. Do you guys see this as something that's going to happen in the near future? How close are we to that, and who will do it, do you think? I mean, I should put the caveat here that Israel, of course, is already suspected of engaging in some of this stuff, aside from Stuxnet. But we're not seeing a lot of it in the other countries. I'm sorry?
I can't prove or deny the cyber capabilities of Israel, but what can I say, as I mentioned earlier, when Hamas tried to attack Israel in the cyber domain, Israel, the IDF, returned with a missile and attacked the base that launched this cyber attack. And this is really interesting because in some cases we see wipers, as we saw with Shamoon, Stuxnet, and Zero Clear. And in some cases we saw a really clash in the battlefield because of cyber attack. Now all the stories that we see in the media about the cyber war between Israel and Iran on the matter of water authorities and the port in Bandar Abbas, this is something that can go to a cyber war, including wipers in the Middle East that will destroy companies, as NotPetya did, for example. It wasn't the same wiper as Shamoon, but as NotPetya did in Ukraine.
Let's talk about that for a second, because what we've seen between Israel and Iran lately, I think a lot of people would sort of categorize as skirmishes. Even the most recent one that Israel launched against the ports that caused a backup of both shipping traffic and trucking traffic. So I'm wondering, like, what do you view as the bar for these countries to judge, and Israel in particular? Like, what is that bar in a cyber attack, a cyber offensive operation that would lead a nation like Israel or one of the other nations to actually take this into the physical realm, either in all-out war or even just a single bomb or bombing? What is that threshold?
I think that one of the problems with the story right now is that most of it is going by the media. And there are a lot of cyber attacks against Israel executed by multiple threat actors, and in Iran executed by multiple threat actors. And both of cases not exposed really often. We saw an increase of the publications and the covering of the media right now on the story of the skirmish, as you said, between Iran and Israel. Israel didn't approve that Iran attacked its water authorities, and it didn't claim responsibility for the attack against the Bandar Abbas port. It all goes by the media, and I think that is the most problematic issue on the last events, because when we exposed, for example, in the company that I work for, an operation of 3 years espionage operation of Iran in Israel in protection or secure organizations, some of them are belong to the government. Nobody really cared about it as they cared about some unattack. Allegedly, Iran not approved officially on the water authorities, that we don't know what is the damage or we don't know what tools used in that attack. I think this is another problem that we see right now.
So you're saying that because the public doesn't really see the full picture, if there is some kind of physical response, then the public doesn't necessarily see the justification for it? Is that what you're hinting at?
I'm saying that there are a lot of attacks, and some of them using wipers, some of them go to the real world, go to destruct and destroy some things, but we don't really hear about it. This is the first time in years that people talk about clashes between Iran and Israel. We see a lot of attacks. If someone in the industry sees Iran attack Israel all the time, not only Israel. And I'm not saying that Iran only attack and not get attacked back. And we see a lot of these attacks going daily basis. But now we see something that goes over the radar. Someone noticed an attack. Someone wanted to be published. And this is one of the problems right now.
So what is the threshold, do you view, of what would lead to some kind of physical attack as well? I mean, what would Iran have to do? What kind of attack would Iran have to do against Israel that would cause Israel to either all-out war or either, I mean, are we talking about loss of life or a lower threshold than that? What is the,
I don't
what's the
know.
bar?
I don't know, I can say my opinion. And my opinion is that we saw wipers used by Iran in Saudi Arabia, as mentioned before. We didn't see wipers in Israel. I think this is something that Israel will not allow. I think if some country, any country, not only Iran, will attack Israel, Israel will respond. This is one opinion. And I think this is the bar. If it can cause death, of course, that Israel will decide to attack back, but I don't know if the attack will be some wipers or some radiation, or it's going to be something under the surface that the attacker won't know about it until it is too late.
So let's say that the attack that's been attributed to Iran against, or the attempted attack against the Israeli water distribution, let's say that it was successful in either well, shutting off water isn't quite as dangerous as maybe altering the chemical process of processing the water. If it was something like that that had some kind of public health issue, but didn't ultimately result in someone dying, is that a threshold for a physical attack, a bombing, or is that still in the cyber realm, do you think, for a response?
I'd really love to get Chris's take on this because she's been following Sicker for so long. And we're always asked this question, right? I mean, I talked about it a lot. A lot of them do. Chris, please, can we get your take?
Sure. One of the things that we did a couple of years ago was we ran cyber warfare exercises with NATO and EU members, and we posed this question with various scenarios. And the threshold appeared to be with the scenarios that we had, like causing the London Underground trains to smash into each other by being hacked during rush hour, and other kind of life and death things. And out of that, from the life and death ones, the majority of the diplomats and ministers and so forth said that they would absolutely join up, at least with, for instance, NATO or EU solidarity. And one group, my particular group, launched a nuclear weapon in the upper atmosphere of the attacking country. Of course, it would be my group. Right. So I think that, you know, once that threshold of attribution and no other diplomatic means can be used, if there's a good deal of loss of life, absolutely.
What prompted that nuclear response?
The reason for it was to shut off the capabilities of the attacking nation by creating an electromagnetic pulse. And over 10,000 people had died in the scenario.
I see. I want to stay just a little more with these recent skirmishes with Iran and Israel. I guess I want to sort of address the, I guess I want to address whether or not this is a signal of a change from Iran. In terms of its boldness and the visibility of what it's doing. Do you all see this as an expansion and a significant turn for Iran? Or is this just more of, you know, kind of testing the waters still?
So for the Israel specific incident, I still am not, so attribution is difficult, and we've discussed that and everybody in cyber knows that. I did not see, the cybersecurity companies didn't come out. Nobody confirmed that it was Iran in Israel with the water issues, the system. I'm not saying that it wasn't, because obviously they're enemies. Obviously there's tension. It's ongoing. Absolutely. But in general, Iran's activities in the Middle East have been more blatant and have been more brazen. They're towing the line, they're pushing the limits. And it's because, you know, everybody else outside is kind of sitting here saying, number one, how did this cyber program get so strong? How did we miss this? This seems like it developed quickly. Number two, what is our red line? What is going to force us to respond in any way? And number three, what would that response look like, right? So attribution's hard, but in general, Iran has just been acting, again, taking a page out of Russia's book. Here we are, we're doing this. What do you want? You know, what are you going to do back? And that's really interesting. So it's an expansion and it's a turning point, and it's almost a challenge, I want to say, because we'll see what happens. Or is it just going to be more sanctions and more economic, or is it going to turn to something else? But Iranian cyber activities against their neighbors, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi, Israel, they're still continuing against the West, right? Parliament in the UK, Parliament in Australia, they're everywhere. They're doing it all. And they're not as blatant as they are in Saudi Arabia, where they leave, you know, code that says, you know, death to Israel or et cetera, right? They've literally put that in their code left behind on systems in Israel and Saudi Arabia, but all over the world, they're acting and they're just going and kind of seeing what they can get away with. And for now, it's working.
Do you agree?
It was exposed. Yes, I couldn't say it better. I just want to say that the attribution is really tricky, and we don't know it, and we didn't get any confirmation by Israel that Iran is standing behind this attack. And this is really important to understand, because we are talking about a skirmish between Iran and Israel right now, but we don't know if there was even one attack, the attack on Bandar Abbas or the attack on the Israel Water Authority by Iran or by Israel. I could say it better. And I want to echo what Steph said. Only a few days ago, it was exposed by Google that Charmin Keaton tried to hack a Donald Trump campaign. And this is really interesting because we saw China targeting Joe Biden. We saw Iran attack its neighbors. We saw Iran attack foreign countries. We saw Iran attack Germany, as Steph mentioned earlier. They attack everyone right now, everyone that has interests, that have any kind of goals to attack them, even if it's a aerospace company. This is really, really interesting country to follow by examining the profile of the victims.
It's also notable too, so for instance, with Israel, the breaking sources were two unidentified, off-the-record government officials who watched that water attack happen in real time. I am in no way comfortable, despite the tensions in history, saying, okay, yes, it was Iran. That is not something to go off of. Now, Iran with other countries and elections supported Russia in 2016, supported Russia in the 2018 primaries, supported meddling in European and Nigerian elections in 2019. Are now working with China. They have a partnership with China, they have a partnership with Russia, and they take vengeful action against the US. That is where something, you know, profiling their case in history, okay, we're comfortable with that. Not to unnamed off the record officials for an Israeli water attack. No way.
Does everyone agree? Okay, I guess we'll go on. I want to sort of address that issue sort of with the skirmishes between Iran and Israel. I mean, we've established, not that we needed to, that Israel has the greatest capabilities in the region. And Israel has been in this game for a lot longer than anyone else there, also in terms of defense. So I wanted to ask the question of really how vulnerable is Israel to attacks from its neighbors? Let's leave out the bigger players of China and Russia and anyone else there. But how vulnerable really is US to Iran in the cyber realm, or to anyone else there who might attack them?
Well, I can tell you, kind of vulnerable. It depends on what laws they passed recently. For example, in late 2018, they mandated that any mixed gender establishments had to have IoT cameras that the religious portion of the police had to view. And this also meant that they had default credentials and all used the same credentials, and left a window directly into all sorts of video and sound and private communications between families, people in restaurants and entertainment facilities. So I would say that they are quite vulnerable.
I'd like to add in the IoT game. That is a trend and a threat that I'm watching very closely. That's an excellent point, Chris. IoT is going to be everywhere, and Iran is already exposing or going after, I'm sorry, exposed Elasticsearch clusters. They're targeting cloud infrastructure, which is where all of that is hosted. Iran also knows trends. And so if Israel and other prominent cities in the Middle East are adopting that, they definitely need to adopt the same protections, because otherwise that does open them up and make them extremely vulnerable extremely quickly.
In terms of the defense, let's sort of stick with that for a second. And Chris, you can talk with this in particular. What should nations there be doing? And I'm wondering if any of you are aware of any sort of cooperative agreements between nations in the Middle East for some kind of defense, like the way we've got with NATO. Not just in sort of response, like if you get hit, we will partner with you, but in terms of developing defensive capabilities or training or resources or infrastructure or anything like that. Are you aware of any of that kind of collaboration? What is the level of defense capabilities?
Well, there is some collaboration between some of the GCC countries in the Middle East. And I do welcome that because you know, obviously, if one nation does not have the defensive capabilities, then other like-minded nations should go ahead and jump in when they can, if they can. I would advise governments, firstly, take the risk of cyber security very seriously, part of the national defense strategy, and also get an advisory board with qualified individuals, not just techies, not just academia, also legal, also, you know, a range of people, and give those boards an actual voice.
I can't necessarily speak to the collaboration angle, but in terms of you know, customers in the Middle East and governments and things, they are all kind of on track to developing defensive capabilities. Like we mentioned before, Saudi setting up the National Cybersecurity Center, and other countries are doing kind of similar things. I think it does get very difficult. We've done some, you know, incident responses and victim tip-offs in the region for when we find victims, but often I think it's difficult to kind of get there. We always go through a third party oftentimes because, you know, a lot of this is built around trust relationships. So it can be difficult to approach someone just out of the blue. But obviously there is quite a lot of activity in the Middle East, and those countries are kind of victims of a lot of intrusions. So it's not always easy, but I think they are kind of, again, developing, and that's going to take time to get to the level of maturity that they need to have kind of proper defenses in their networks.
So we've got a question from the audience from Amna Ibrahim. The question is about Iran-backed non-state actors. How is Iran able to train them, and what is the US or even Israel able to accurately do to monitor those capabilities of these non-state actors that are trained and employed? And how are we able to, or are we able in any way to anticipate the cyber attacks that are being developed?
I can take that. You know, the Iranian conscription period is, I think, 18 months. In some cases, it's 24 months, so 2 years. And those individuals can serve fully their time as a government-supported, trained hacker, essentially. Now, 2 years is not an extensive amount of time, but it certainly gives you enough that if you keep up with it and train yourself, you can definitely act, you know, on your own and have an effect as a government-backed hacker that then turns independent. I think that that contingent of people allows Iran plausible deniability. They can say, we didn't know our people were doing this. We don't support that, and we monitor our internet, you know, so how could they get away with this? So there's that aspect to it. And tracking and training that, it's extremely difficult. I mean, they're moving to Telegram, they're locking down their infrastructure, they're using Signal, they have their own in-country Iranian developed apps that, sure, might be monitored by the Iranian government, but if those cyber actors give a cut of money or funds or technology or train other government-backed actors for Iran and continue the Iranian government's capabilities, the Iranian government's going to turn a blind eye because they're facilitated by the independent actors. So it's extremely difficult to track them because they know what systems to use to not be tracked. And then they're becoming more and more in numbers because, face it, what other career and what other opportunities do Iranians, young ones, have right now? The economy's not great. There are no jobs, and tech is easy. You can YouTube from your basement. So it's that simple.
I think you can see the parallels to kind of the physical realm here in terms of the use of proxies. So we know that Iran kind of does that militarily. You can see a lot of non-state actors, Hezbollah being a really easy, clear example. So you do see similar things in cyber operations as well. And, in terms of training or funding, that's definitely the case. I think that, in terms of how they're kind of cyber operations model or structure works as well. As was mentioned, there are a lot of contractors. There are a lot of more autonomous, could be front companies or could be separate independent third-party contractors that the government does use. And again, can be for many reasons, deniability, a little bit of decentralization. But I think that they've kind of done that model pretty well compared to some other countries where it might be more centralized. But you definitely see the kind of parallels between physical realm and using proxies in this area.
Sahar, that's a great point. You brought up front companies, and I wanted to overemphasize that. That's another way the Iranian government is kind of supporting them, but in the background, there's a ton of front companies, both in Iran, but then also in places like the UAE or neighboring countries that really do procure both software and hardware and enable them and act completely independently. And those ties can be immediately severed to, again, provide that plausible deniability. And that has been an increasing trend. Again, just like Russia, they're taking a page out of that book too. So.
Interesting. I want to, this is a great question also from the audience, from JD. How do Iran's cyber operations in the region support its national objectives? What's its goal, for instance, in deploying a wiper attack or doing other operations, like if we attribute the water attack to Iran? What is the end game here? Is Iran just an agent of chaos, or is it deriving some kind of particular aim? What is it hoping to get out of all of this?
I think this is the most trickiest question regarding Iran or regarding any state that using cyber capabilities. We don't really know why Iran attacked. If we examine the victim profile of Charmin Kitten, for example, we see some reasonable targets that we can assess that, okay, we know why Iran attacked them. We can understand why Iran want to attack the campaign of Donald Trump. We don't really know why Iran want to attack some researchers in universities around the world that investigating Iran, because this is nothing relevant to a country, this is nothing relevant to any secret agency, but they are still attacking them in really high volume. So I think this is one of the most trickiest questions. In my opinion, the regime have some targets that they want to do, some goals that they want to do. Most of them are espionaging. But if they want to retaliate, if they want to show their power and to gain all the fame, let's call it like that, of being a cyber power in the Middle East, this is something that we should discuss, because as we all talk about Israel capabilities, we don't really see a lot of reports about some attacks by Israel, but we still know that Israel is a great power in the Middle East on the matter of cyber capabilities. Iran, I think, can use the cyber warfare as another aspect to gain power in the Middle East as well.
So if you look at the breakup or the distribution of the APTs, 33, 4, 5, and 9, they do seem to have some sort of guidance or general mission or general focus. Some are more for spear phishing, that gets you contacts and gets you access for information into political or whatever, election tampering they might want to do. And that feeds the Iranian government as well. Furthermore, they have a dissident targeting campaign all over the world, right? That instills fear everywhere. They act inside their borders and they act outside of it. They don't want criticism of the regime, and establishing themselves in cyber to spy on those people and take action against it using cyber methods, establishes them as a strength in the region. So they want to feed the government information. They do want to cause chaos, but let's also be serious. This is the first time in 50 years that Iran's ever been considered an equal. Previously they couldn't get weapons, technology, or anything. This with cyber, they are on par with Russia and China, and they are a force to be reckoned with. And they're demonstrating that while also stealing intellectual property, impacting negatively critical infrastructure or companies, and just really causing fear in addition to chaos.
I want to, oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that, their cyber operations are definitely part of a larger strategy, as with any country and as, with any other arm of the state or intelligence apparatus. This stuff is coordinated, and there's, a logical reason behind it to support the national policies. So as was mentioned, the distant targeting is obviously one, whether it's the diaspora or within the country. But, the majority of their operations, bar the kind of a handful of destructive attacks that you see, are espionage related, and that's what every other country does. It's foreign intelligence collection. I mean, I don't necessarily think that they should be put on a separate kind of place here, saying that they're so different than all the other countries. Well, to be honest, all the other countries are doing it too. Espionage is kind of something that's understood as an acceptable norm at this point. So them being in networks all around the world isn't that different from any other country, whether it's Russia or China or any of the ones in the West either. I think the kind of destructive and sabotage element of it is a bit different from the rest of them as well. So that might put them on a kind of looking at them a bit differently. But in terms of everything else, it's definitely supplementing the kind of information that they would get from human operations as well, like any other country. So we've seen a case where in an incident response, we saw one of the Iranian actors targeting an airline and going after passenger data or kind of other databases about itineraries, where people were traveling, the plane routes, those kind of things. And presumably that was linked to a human operation that was doing the same thing. So I think because, that value, that data is valuable, and it kind of provides more to kind of the rest of the ops as well.
We're looking on the organizations that operate cyber activities in Iran. We can look at the IRGC, and we can look on two ministries, the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Intelligence. And there is a tension inside Iran, tension between the IRGC and the ministries of the government. And this is another thing that we should examine. We can talk about goals of Iran, but we should talk about goals of the IRGC, as Sarah mentioned, about some human operations, for example, and we can talk about some other methods of the Iranian government.
Let's talk about sort of where the cyber capabilities sit then. Who within the government is the biggest player in terms of offensive nation states, not on domestic or anything like that. So who do you say is, Ohad or anyone else, is the most driving force behind this? Is it the IRGC or who else?
In my opinion, it's the IRGC.
I would say MOIS.
MOIS.
They each have their capabilities, and he's right. There's tension between them. They kind of there's spats between one another. The IRGC and the MOIS will point fingers at one another, saying, "We didn't do that. We didn't know that was happening." The MOIS is considered a bit more sophisticated and savvy at this point in the cyber realm. The IRGC makes a few mistakes that I talked about before, reveals information that can then be used against them, but they're still sophisticated. But both of them have equal powers, for the most part, equal tools, equal access. So they're battling each other right now to kind of come out dominant in Iran. But the MOIS and the IRGC both work outside of borders, externally targeting in the cyber realm. So it's something to consider for both. But MOIS is just a bit more sophisticated and savvy.
Yeah, I think they have maybe slightly, different tasking and kind of different a little bit in their objectives, but and obviously in terms of a visibility kind of issue, you don't really know the full story. But I would also say that the Ministry of Intelligence and IRGC both have significant capabilities. So I wouldn't necessarily put it on one or the other. The one thing I would note, though, is that despite kind of the, definitely tensions between them and their back and forth blame game and all of these things, and a bit of turf wars in terms of, responsibilities and jurisdiction, is that at the end of the day, they are still working for, one government and one state policy, and kind of national goals don't differ across that. So, I mean, they could expect, some kind of reprisal if they were going off and doing, rogue things. But as long as it's, in the interests of the country and the national strategy, then I think that's still probably where they're going to be the same.
There's a question from Kenneth Shara I'm not getting that name right, about sort of the economic impact. I'm wondering, I want to sort of tweak that a little and look at sort of, are we seeing any behind the scenes skirmishes that are in going after banking infrastructure or anything else that would impact the economic livelihood or health of a nation? I'll open that to all of you.
No, we've seen some various attacks to do that, especially when there have been cases where accounts have been closed because they've been found out as shell companies. So also a bit of retaliation.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely if they can kind of use that leverage and twist an arm where they want to especially make sure that other governments or banks or whatever know how strong they are and not to mess with them. We have seen those.
Well, it's just, what sort of prompts the question for me is in the war against Iraq, there was a plan sort of floated about the US going after Saddam Hussein's banking interests. And if I recall correctly, it was the US Treasury Secretary who nixed it because of the sort of the interplay between all of the economies of the world, and there was uncertainty about the repercussions, the reverberations of that. And so that's what I'm wondering, if there's any kind of understanding of sort of keeping hands off on the economic parts in the Middle East, or is that something that people are going to go after? I mean, there are obvious ways of going after the economic interest by going after the shipping, going after the oil, things like that. But is there any sort of concerted effort to sort of cripple economy of an adversary?
I think one of the threats for the economic sector, for the financial sector, is that Iran targets a lot of companies from the supply chain, let's call it like that, from the IT sector, for example. And if Iran succeed to hack some IT company, let's say in Israel, and then they use their infrastructure in order to attack another company, and we see that they did it all the time, and they do it all the time, and they try to hack some companies like that in order to hack others. I think at some point they might want to hack some banks, some financial organization, not for stealing money mandatory, but maybe because of some of these organizations have a lot of issues with the governments, and they can affect on the governments. If some big bank in Israel, maybe the main bank of Israel, will get attacked by Iranian government, this is something that can cause a lot of damage to the country that was attacked. I think this is real threat to the financial sector and to any sector right now in the Middle East.
Yeah, from our perspective, it's kind of the same. I've never seen, barring the kind of 2011, 2012 DDoS attacks in the US, I haven't seen the financial sector as a priority target for any of the Iranian actors. I think, you constantly see government, you see aerospace, defense, energy, those kind, and especially what Ohad mentioned about supply chain as well, and things like managed service providers or IT service providers, ISPs, telecommunications is huge, obviously. And I think, as you said, that provides a pivot point, and you can, if you can get access to that network, you have the access to the customers as well, potentially. And so I think that kind of any financial kind of targeting that's happened from our perspective has just been in kind of mass campaigns where it's literally a numbers game, and they're targeting many organizations around the world, kind of regardless of sector.
Okay, so we've reached sort of the end of the time that we have, but I just want to go past all of the panelists right now and give me your view of what do you think is the next step of what we're going to see in the Middle East. What do you anticipate as the next sort of turning point, or the next country coming up, or what is going to be the most concerning thing that we see next? Total speculation is fine.
I would say watch out for Yemen because Iran is using part of their population as form of proxy war with some of the cyber attacks, and they're training them up on that side that backs Iran. And I would not be surprised if that is the next segment of the Middle East that starts getting quite developed.
I would say proxy wars and hybrid conflicts, you're going to have a cyber and a physical aspect to every conflict or everything that happens. And to support Chris's statement, she's right, between Ansar Allah or the Houthis in Yemen, Hezbollah, ISIS, ISIL, et cetera, every player that can have the power and shape anything in the Middle East will do so. And they'll try to take advantage of either a physical, cyber, or a hybrid situation.
If we're looking on the Corona period, as some point that Iran really affected by this virus, and I think it's really important to understand that Iran tried to hack some companies that in normal days Iran won't attack, such as Gilead, the company that developed the drug for the virus, or the World Health Organization. This is something that Iran never did before. And I think that we are going to see some other threat actors in the Middle East trying to attack more civil organizations from the private sector, maybe from the health sector, because of this virus and because of global events that will affect the way of thinking of some regimes in the Middle East.
I think, I guess I will comment on something other than Iran, but I would actually say the hackers for hire landscape, because I think there's a lot of contractor companies out there, a lot of ones that are willing to provide hacking services. And it kind of, there's plenty of money floating around the Middle East in the right places, and plenty of resources to fund that kind of work. And it kind of gives everyone equal access and equal opportunity, right? So if you don't have the capabilities, you buy them. So whether it's from high-end, spyware vendors, or it's from kind of other lower level contracting companies, it's still bringing more players into the landscape. So I think you're just going to see that activity increase quite a lot, whether it's against each other or kind of other countries in the world.
Great. This has been a fascinating discussion for me, and I already know a lot about the Middle East. So I'm hoping that the audience enjoyed it as well. Please join me, everyone, in thanking all of our panelists. I know that we can't hear the applause, but we can imagine that you're all applauding. And I'm going to hand this back over to Mike to close us out. I think I am. Mike? Is anyone at MEI there? Okay, so I'm not sure what we do at this point.
I think you can end the broadcast, Kim. Oh, there's Mike. Looks like he's coming. I think you can end it, Kim. And
Mike?
Hi. So into a t-shirt. I hadn't expected I would. Thank you all so much for coming. We really appreciate it. And anyone who you think may have been interested, who may be interested to watch the panels at a later date, they're all going to be on the YouTube channel of the Middle East Institute. So we encourage you to share those around. Thank you to all of I will physically applaud you all. Thank you so much for taking the time, all of you. We really, really appreciate it. That was an excellent panel. Not just this one, all of the ones prior. This has been an incredible day. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.